He was a firebrand, an openly gay man and activist who challenged Chicago's leaders to do more to help educate the public about the AIDS crisis. Today we're discussing the outrage of Danny Sotomayor. I'm Tommy Henry, and this is the Chicago History Podcast. WTTW has been making Chicago Stories episodes for more than 30 years, and each time they announce a new round of episodes, I get a little giddy. Sure, I enjoy the lighter fare Chicago Stories episodes like the one about how Chicago was once the candy capital of the country, or the one about Chicago's mail order industry, but the episodes about people who strive to make a difference in this city fully capture my attention.
I would describe Danny Sotomayor as driven, devoted, and deeply in touch with his mortality.
That's Dan Andries, the writer and producer of WTTW's The Outrage of Danny Sotomayor, talking about the main subject of that documentary. The Outrage of Danny Sotomayor will be re-airing on Thursday, June 27th, 2024, as part of Pride Month, but is available now on WTTW and on YouTube. Links are in the show's notes. We'll hear more from Dan Andries in a bit, but first, if you aren't familiar with the name Danny Sotomayor, here's a little background. Daniel Sotomayor was born in August of 1958 to a Mexican mother and a Puerto Rican father, and grew up in Chicago's Humboldt Park neighborhood. The Sotomayor household was turbulent at times, and young Danny found an escape from the chaos by focusing on creativity and drawing. After graduating from Prosser High School, Sotomayor pursued acting at the Center Theater, performing in such plays as It's a Wonderful Town and a Chekhov adaptation. He studied graphic arts at the American Academy of Art and then enrolled at Columbia College in Chicago. Danny began drawing political cartoons for various publications, and his work got noticed. Before long, readers could see Sotomayor's work in Chicago's Windy City Times, as well as in newspapers in San Francisco, New York, Philadelphia, and Indianapolis. Sotomayor is considered to be the first nationally syndicated, openly gay political cartoonist. According to friends, it wasn't until he was diagnosed with AIDS in 1988, at the age of 29, that Sotomayor became an activist, using his platform as an artist to call out those he felt responsible for the worsening AIDS crisis. In one of his most well-known and controversial cartoons in 1989, Sotomayor calls out then U.S. President George H.W. Bush. In this simple one-panel cartoon, the president is shown sitting in bed, reading a newspaper with the headline, 100,000 diagnosed with AIDS in the U.S. Bush's wife, First Lady Barbara Bush, asks him if there's anything important in the paper. Bush replies with, nope. While Richard M. Daley, elected mayor of Chicago in April of 1989, had the support of the gay and lesbian community at the polls, once he was in office, that support began to wane. One big reason? The AIDS epidemic that was ravaging the gay community. Danny Sotomayor had joined ACT UP Chicago, described in the Chicago Tribune as, quote, a militant AIDS awareness group, and quote, that was not afraid of having its members arrested to increase visibility for their cause. In November of 1989, 8 years after the first reported case of AIDS was diagnosed in Chicago, the city unveiled what was called a comprehensive, multifaceted strategic plan to help educate people on how to avoid getting the disease. Danny Sotomayor shouted down the campaign, which made no mention about the use of condoms as, quote, garbage. Monday, April 23, 1990, a protest formed around 8 a.m. at the Prudential Building at 130 East Randolph Street, where demonstrators from ACT UP Chicago, including Sotomayor and his friend Lori Cannon, called out the company for the lack of health insurance for AIDS sufferers. The protesters moved north along Michigan Avenue to the Blue Cross Blue Shield offices on North St. Clair, continuing to the American Medical Association at Grand Avenue and State Street, where protesters denounced the AMA's opposition to national health insurance. Outside the AMA building, 5 arrests were made. As demonstrators moved onto the Nuveen building at 333 West Wacker to protest insurance firm Money, 24 more activists were arrested. The crowd, which police estimated numbered more than 1,000, then headed to the Cook County building across from Daley Plaza. Danny Sotomayor walked into the county building with a group of friends, all dressed in business attire. Sneaking past his secretary, they gained access to a third-floor ledge and unfurled a giant banner that read, "We demand equal health care now." With a large crowd shouting from the streets, Sotomayor and other activists were dragged back inside by police, and more arrests were made in the streets. By the end of the day, more than 129 arrests were made, with most of those charged with disorderly conduct and mob action. Sotomayor had made a name for himself in the fight against AIDS. Regarding ACT UP Chicago, the Chicago LGBT Hall of Fame website wrote this: ACT UP Chicago demanded a multifaceted approach to fighting AIDS. Their actions helped lead to Chicago's tripling and Illinois' doubling their AIDS budgets. ACT UP Chicago challenged price gouging by drug manufacturers, forcibly posted sex-positive propaganda to fight public transit officials' refusal to post safe sex ads, and protested violence and police brutality against persons with AIDS and lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgendered persons. Danny Sotomayor died of issues related to AIDS on February 5, 1992, and was buried at Rose Hill Cemetery in Chicago. According to Art Johnston, founder of Sidetrack on Halsted Street, quote, "When he died, a part of all of us died." Johnson added that Richard M. Daley, a frequent focus of Sotomayor's anger, attended Danny's funeral, quote, and gave him the respect of a fallen warrior. I asked producer Dan Andries why he thought Daley made an appearance at the funeral.
The question of why Mayor Richard M. Daley attended Danny Sotomayor's funeral is a really rich one. To everybody there who was part of ACT UP Chicago, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, everybody there who were his friends and caretakers, everybody there except for his family, who was also there, this was the height of opportunistic political showmanship. Just an empty thing, easy to do, and it wasn't enough. This is the time of people saying when something comes forward, well, that's not enough. And so these people said essentially that's not enough. And they made it plain to the mayor's entourage and mayor's people that this wasn't going to do it. This wasn't going to cut it. And I do believe there was a great sincerity on Daley's part to connect with this community and to make things work with this community. So it's got two sides to it. I do know that, there was a memorial button that was at the funeral, and the mayor took it, and the word is that once he hit the limo, he threw it into the gutter. I heard that story once from somebody. I don't know if it's true, but it's a story I heard, and it's a perception. So, what happened is because the mayor went to the funeral and didn't receive any love, he tried harder. In some ways, it was like one more protest by Danny Sotomayor through his people to push it further. And that might be one of the reasons why Helen Schiller was able to successfully, besides the fact that a lot of data was leaked to her by ACT UP people who got on the inside and got the budget and a lot of information. She did a lot of pushing. I think there was a desire to figure out how to make this better. And as you know, the mayor, Mayor Daley, became a real champion of the gay community, and he put up those pylons on Halsted Street, and the gay games, everything. What his administration did is a model, but it took a lot of fighting, and that's one of the things I love about the story. It's a story about fighting in a way that creates change, and it's about how you participate in a democracy. And for Danny Sotomayor, with the time he had, that's how he participated. And it's called civil disobedience. and it's called protesting, and it's called, that sort of stuff, activism. And that stuff has a place, and it has a purpose. That's a good example of what I think the funeral was: one more act of civil disobedience by the community.
Danny Sotomayor's companion, playwright Scott McPherson, said of Danny, "I've known a lot of people with this disease. I've never seen anyone fight it so hard. He fought it not only for himself, but also for everybody. He was one of the funniest, most motivated, clear-thinking, compassionate people I've ever known." McPherson joined Sotomayor on death just 9 months later. During my discussion with Dan Andries, writer and producer for The Outrage of Danny Sotomayor, I asked him a few questions about making the documentary. One of the first things I wanted to know was how the Danny Sotomayor story made it to Chicago Stories.
Danny Sotomayor becoming a Chicago Stories on WFMT is what I would call a minor miracle. I work at a public television station in Chicago. This is not Hollywood, but honestly, this thing has been bouncing around in my head for 15 years. And I've tried different iterations of exciting the station about it. And one day, lo and behold, the executive producer of Chicago Stories said, "Yeah, I'm pitching that." And I was elated. And I said, "You better not let anybody else do it." He said, "No, no, 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 no." And then it didn't get selected that season, and then it came back the next, and it got chosen. And I've been working closely with Laurie Cannon for a long time on the potential of this. And I saw this could have been a feature film. This could have been any number of iterations. And, I considered trying to get someone to help me write a screenplay, looked into legal rights, talked to lawyers, realized I had to contact the family, this sort of stuff. And I remember calling Laurie the day it was greenlit and said, "Laurie, it's happening. Let's go. When can I meet?" And she said to me, "Well, do you want to just meet me, or do you want to meet with Victor Salvo?" I said, "I want to just meet with you." Okay. And I went to meet her, and there was Victor. So they're a team of history. But it was chosen. I believe it was chosen because it's a great story. It has such an incredible form and such a beautiful takeaway. I mean, it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. This is about a guy, an artist, a creative person, a fun person, a gay person being stricken with AIDS and going, "Oh my Lord, what am I going to do with myself?" And finding the salvation to the last years of his life in activism and carrying it out in a spectacular way, and then slowly succumbing to death, and then resurrecting really in all kinds of amazing ways, from legal ways to, being on the quilt to et cetera, et cetera. So it's just a great story.
Having pitched variations on the story for more than 15 years, I wondered if Dan had a script for this ready to go when he finally got approval to make the Danny Sotomayor story for Chicago Stories, and if there were any surprises in making this documentary.
My approach to making documentaries is, if I can't tell you the story beat by beat, moment by moment out loud, then I don't have it. So I tend to work that way. I do, so writing things, sure, notes, etc., but I understood the basic structure of the story from the beginning. What surprised me about this was discovering just how incredibly present Danny was everywhere, and about the work that these people, ACT UP Chicago, did around the country. I mean, I'm hearing about all kinds of New York activist moments that Danny was at, and I'm thinking he wasn't there. And then I look at film, and there he is, he's there. And trips down south to situations where people were, really subjected to some pretty brutal kind of incarceration that cops do when they're trying to close down demonstrators. So his like running around the country thing surprised me. There's a great story about them driving down south somewhere, 4 of them in a car. It's on the documentary, and having, in the middle of the night and having some car trouble and being terrified. This is in Alabama or Georgia or something. I hate to mess up the details, but terrified that they were going to be, subjected to some pretty awful treatment, and somehow miraculously be kind of led by a cop to a service station so they could continue on their way. So there were stories I hadn't heard before. I think the other thing that was I never knew really was the story of Danny's childhood from the point of view of his family, in particular his brother David. And David was someone I contacted once the documentary got going. And the relationship between Danny's family and his activist family was quite fraught. So I don't think anybody had talked to David Sotomayor about his brother this way since Danny died, really.
I asked Dan Andries if there was anyone who didn't want to participate or if there were people he wished he could have nailed down for this project.
I found some, people who have spoken in the past really eloquently to other journalists and other people covering this story, and they just didn't want to go on camera for reasons that I can't always fully understand. And that's okay. There wasn't anybody super key. I really wanted to get somebody in the Daley administration to talk to me, somebody from that time. And the mayor would have been incredible, but I've tried to get the mayor for things before. That would have been quite a coup. So I banged on the door of one of his former press secretaries a lot and tried some inside routes and really got nowhere. So, I wasn't looking because Danny's relationship with the mayor was entirely antagonistic with a purpose. And so anything Danny saw wrong, he wanted to have it fixed. And he saw that the budget in the city and the approach to AIDS in the city from, the city hall's power seat wasn't great. And he wanted to change that. So he just confronted the mayor constantly. And everybody is, of course, working behind the scenes trying to make this all work. And here's this guy who shows up at press conferences, shows up at parties, shows up wherever, and starts yelling at him. So they didn't always love how Danny did it. But quite frankly, Danny moved the needle with that guy. And so I wasn't looking to hear from the press secretary how embarrassed they all were. I wanted to hear how that might have felt from the inside. One of the people who talked to me wonderfully about things was Lori Dittman, and she was part of an inside group of activists that we talk about in the documentary that the press dubbed the Gang of Four. They did some work together, but the idea that they were really a unit wasn't really true. But Lori, hasn't been spoken to a lot about this in the past, and her relationship with Danny, had a trigger point at the Impact dinner. This was an activism fundraising group, kind of mainstream, brought a lot of money in, and Danny interrupted their gala, and so that was embarrassing for them, especially because the mayor was there. A year later, when Danny was dying, they gave Danny the big award, and people on the inside who were with Danny's friends considered this kind of hypocrisy. I got to talk to Lori about this, and I don't think it was hypocrisy, but I do think the politics of all of this are always complicated. And I do believe Lori really did, and you can hear it in the documentary, admire and appreciate what Danny was about, even if it was challenging at times to work with what Danny did to things,
In the documentary, Art Johnston, one of the two title characters in the excellent documentary Art and Pep, chokes back tears talking about Danny Sotomayor. I asked Dan Andries if he saw this often with his interviewees.
Oh, yeah. Oh, my God. We carry in our bodies our life experiences. They're there. And you can open them up and re-experience them. You can bring yourself to the moment when you're standing in the plaza looking up and seeing, your friends come out on the balcony and just electrify the crowd if you wanted to, if you were there. You can go back. And, the interview process is one of helping people reactivate their memories. And they're all willing to do it. No one there is like, I can't talk about that. There are things where people would say, I can't talk about that. And that's fine. Sometimes they end up talking about it. That's kind of the reality of an interview. But yes, Danny, when I first met Art, when I was making Out and Proud in Chicago with Alex Silitz in 2008 here at the station, that's when I first learned about Danny, was in the process of making that. And I was like, whoa, this is incredible. Who was this guy? What happened? And someone said, you got to talk to Art about this. And I went to talk to Art, and I was like, I'll talk about Danny anytime you want, Dan. And, he has moved to tears by it. Now, he is older, and, he's looking at his own mortality more than he did when he was, 60. So I think some of these tears are richer and deeper for people. I mean, Rick Garcia, as soon as I began the interview, was crying. And I said, "Oh, Rick, I'm so sorry." He goes, "No, this is great. This is great. We have to do this. We have to do this." The pain is not gone for these people or the joy of what they had. People think of Danny as a firebrand. I'm certainly responsible for motivating that and pushing it further. But I think he was also very funny and had a great sense of playfulness and joy. And I hope a little of that comes through in the documentary as well.
With a running time of less than an hour, I was curious as to whether there was anything that didn't make the cut that might be included in a director's version of the Danny Sotomayor story.
People say to me, does it bother you to have to make something that's 26 minutes and 46 seconds or 56 minutes and 46 seconds or 2 hours or whatever? No, it doesn't bother me. It's like an architect has a piece of land. Well, I want some of your neighbor's land too for your house. Well, we can't have it. Well, but my house is going to be bigger. Well, you got to make your house in the size of the land you have. And so I always make my houses, so to speak, on the size of the land I have. That being said, my research is voluminous. The piles of information, the interview transcripts, fill binders. So there's a lot of information, a lot of stories. I would have liked to gone a little deeper into the relationship between ACT UP New York and ACT UP Chicago, in particularly planning that day, the National Day of Action around healthcare and insurance. That was really their masterpiece, so to speak, the ACT UP Chicago. Because New York came in thinking they were the hot shots and Chicago showed them who was boss and that this was their show. And I thought that was fascinating. There was a person who would not be interviewed, which I'm very, very sorry about, because she was a woman in ACT UP who I've known for a long time, and she was happy to talk with me, but she didn't want to go on camera. It's a rule she has. And so there's relationship and dynamics in ACT UP around the different members that include a number of really powerful women. And I kind of wish that story had a chance to come forward. But saving an interview was one of them. It wasn't going. I mean, we have an interview, obviously, with Sandra Johnson, and that's terrific. But there are other people involved, too. And then there's just little stories. Like one of the first actions that they did was they snuck into the State of Illinois building. Client, went up into this is the big atrium of Helmut Jahn's thing, and they threw down hundreds of pink triangles that they had cut out of paper the night before until 2 a.m. or something, and they come fluttering down. There's actually a couple photos of it. And then Danny couldn't get out of the building and got arrested because he was hiding under a desk in one of the governor's offices up there, So, and kind of stories of Danny, like just in the nick of time making an airplane flight or, all of these kinds of things are very wonderful and charming, and I kind of wish there was a place for them. But I also, firmly stand by what we made and don't think it's compromised or gosh, if we only had that. There is one line I wish were in there. And it had been in the edit at different points. And, we're struggling to finish it and get it done. And I don't know how it dropped out. When Danny's on the balcony and he's screaming, "I'm going to jump," Laurie Cannon has a line she said 100,000 times about that moment. And it's very charming, and I wish it could have been in. And what she says is, "I'm looking up at them and thinking, there's Danny. I wonder if I can catch him." And that's a beautiful thing. And emotionally, I don't know how it would fit into the storytelling at the moment, but I kind of think it would be great. And it's as great as somebody saying that's the only time we got a bologna sandwich in jail. Just those little things that remind people that, yes, it's intense, it's big, it's epic, but it's also playful.
Also on June 27th, WTTW is airing Art and Pep, an outstanding documentary about Art Johnston and Jose Pepe Pep Pena, two prominent voices in Chicago's gay community. Last year I did a One on Every Corner Bars episode about their establishment on Halsted called Sidetrack with my friend Mike McMains, who operates Tours with Mike. Art and Pep, directed and produced by Mercedes Kane, covers not only the couple's longtime relationship and their efforts within the LGBTQ community, but also looks at the many changes in Chicago during those years. If you can't wait to watch Art and Pep until the 27th, it is available as of this writing on Peacock. Thanks for listening to today's episode about the outrage of Danny Sotomayor. Special thanks to writer and producer Dan Andries and WTTW for putting Dan and me together. If you have an idea you think would be a good fit for the Chicago History Podcast, I would be thrilled to hear about it. Send me an email at chicagohistorypod@gmail.com. I have links to some of the books I used in researching this episode in the show's notes. As always, any of the items you purchase through those links, not just the ones I've listed, may generate a small commission and help offset the cost of making this podcast at no additional cost to you. If you enjoy this podcast, please leave a 5-star rating or, even better, a written review, especially if you listen on Apple Podcasts, as it will help the podcast grow and reach new fans. Your review may be featured on a future episode or on social media. The Chicago History Podcast logo and the art used on the social media pages was created by John K. Schneider. Fantastico, JKS. If you need creative work done, email him at angeleyesartjks@gmail.com. I'll be back soon with another chapter in Chicago's history. Until then, get out and explore when possible. Learn more about whatever city you live in, and stay safe.